August 17th, 1944. Northern France, near Falaise. The GMC CCKW sat abandoned on the roadside, its canvas cover torn by shrapnel, the engine still warm to the touch, breathing out a slow, metallic heat. The American convoy it belonged to had been clipped by a Luftwaffe strafing run, one of those increasingly rare flashes when German aircraft still appeared over France. And in the scramble and smoke, this deuce and a half had been left behind, a single heartbeat separated from the column that had thundered on. Wehrmacht mechanics from the 276th Infantry Division approached with the caution of men who had learned to read the ground. Boots testing gravel, eyes moving from ditch to hedgerow, then closed in to study the prize. "Get the Hauptfeldwebel," one called, voice kept level. "This one's intact." Over the next hour, what they found confirmed a suspicion that had been growing since Normandy. Germany had not lost this war on the battlefield first, but in the factories, on drafting tables in Detroit where choices were made for millions, not for a few. The truck was massive beside the machines they knew, a 2.5-ton rated workhorse that dwarfed the standard Opel Blitz. The difference was not only in size, it was in attitude. The 6-cylinder engine sat there unafraid, open to the world, parts labeled clearly in English as if the machine wanted to be understood. One mechanic swung open the small toolbox bolted to the running board. Inside, nothing exotic. A row of standard wrenches, pliers that felt familiar in the hand, and a manual printed on thick, quality paper with clean illustrations that seemed to speak even before the words did. The Hauptfeldwebel flipped through its pages, his thumb pausing at the crisp diagrams. "Everything is explained with pictures," he murmured, half to himself. A child could follow these instructions. They had captured American trucks before, but never had they stopped long enough, or dared, to peel back one layer after another with this kind of patience. The GMC's markings told its story in stamped steel, a 1943 CCKW 353, the long wheelbase version, born at the Pontiac plant, one of thousands rolled out that same year. Thousands from a single factory. And the thought settled like a weight, because numbers, once true, do not blink. The first mechanical inspection showed the philosophy behind the metal. The GMC 270 engine, 269 cubic inches, was rated at 104 horsepower. On paper, that figure did not impress German pride. It would not make a mechanic's pulse quicken. But performance, the Hauptfeldwebel realized, was not the point. Every bolt head they touched took the same wrench. Every nut yielded to the same size. Spark plugs sat where hands could reach them without a curse. The oil filter could be changed without any tool at all. One of the younger men muttered, "This is designed for idiots." The senior NCO shook his head, patient and certain. "No," he said, "it's designed for an army of millions, most of them not mechanics. That is the brilliance." He was right. The GMC was not engineered for perfection. It was engineered for America's conscript army, for farm boys out of Iowa and machine hands from Pennsylvania who would climb into a seat on Monday and be road ready by Friday. Components were chosen like words in a clear sentence. Available. Interchangeable, easy to replace, nothing rare, nothing that required a priesthood to maintain. They slid under the frame and examined the 6-wheel drive system. A simple transfer case, a single lever to engage the front axle. No mystery, no ritual, just a motion a driver could memorize in an afternoon. Their Opel Blitz trucks, by contrast, were rear-wheel drive only. They fought French mud like men dragging a plow, forever one mistake away from being mired to the axles, forever calculating momentum and mercy. This American truck simply changed the problem, power to all six when needed, and the rutted lane became a road again. The suspension told another story in the same plain language. Basic leaf springs, crude perhaps, in the eyes of a Stuttgart designer, but close to unbreakable in the field. The Hauptfeldwebel thought of the beautiful torsion bar suspension on the Opel. Elegant, yes, and precise, but a cathedral needs a city around it to stand. Out here, under rain and dust, these leaf springs could be coaxed straight with a hammering rock if that was what the day allowed. You could feel the difference in the knuckles. One system demanded a factory, the other forgave you for being far from home. Then came the numbers, and with numbers came the chill. Stamped into the ladder frame was the Pontiac plant mark. The production sequence pointed to a single truth. This truck was one of roughly 150,000 built in 1943 alone. One plant, 1 year, more trucks than Germany produced across categories, across makers. A mechanic did the math out loud, the way a man tests a bridge before stepping onto it. If one American plant produced this many trucks, how many plants did they have? The answer was not guessed. It was felt. Dozens. GMC, Chevrolet, Studebaker, International Harvester, Dodge, Ford. Names the men had heard on other captured machines, producing vehicles to standardized military specifications, with parts that crossed from one badge to another, as if the whole continent had agreed on a single language of steel. The thought was not abstract. It had weight. Standardization meant the truck in this ditch could be mended with the guts of another 100 kilometers away, and that was a kind of power without flag or anthem. That evening, the unit supply officer joined the circle around the open hood. He had worked at the Opel plant in Brandenburg before the war. He knew the smell of hot oil on a foundry floor, the rhythm of presses, the black dust that settles into the lines on a man's hands. He listened to the quick reports, then lifted his chin. "We're reading this wrong," he said quietly. "We see a simple truck. What this represents is a manufacturing philosophy we cannot match." He went piece by piece, as if conducting an inventory of a whole nation. The stamped steel body panels were nothing to boast about if you loved elegance. They were crude, but any press shop could turn them out by the tens of thousands. The wooden cargo bed used planks any sawmill could cut to length. The canvas top, commercial fabric, not something that needed special permissions or unique looms. Nothing specialized. Everything abundant. He pointed at the chassis, that ladder frame of straight channel steel welded together without delicacy. Any structural steel plant could make these rails. Then he spoke of their own Opel frame rails, precisely formed and requiring dedicated dies that tied you to a particular line, a particular place, a particular day without accidents. The Americans, he said, had designed for their greatest strength, massive industrial capacity, and they had done so without embarrassment. The GMC was not superior to the Opel Blitz in fine engineering. No one needed to pretend otherwise. But it was superior in the one metric that decides the length of a campaign: producibility. Build enough of anything, and it becomes a strategy. His assessment grew darker as he balanced memory against the figures he had seen. In 1943, Germany produced roughly 27,000 Opel Blitz trucks. The Americans likely built 20 times that number of GMCs alone, and that was a single model from a single family of manufacturers. He was probably understating it. American factories, under lights that never dimmed, would go on to produce well over 500,000 trucks of this type, enough to turn roads into arteries that never clotted, enough to teach distance new rules. None of this felt like a revelation shouted from a rooftop. It was more like water rising one quiet inch at a time until the boots knew they were wet. The men had seen other signs. In Normandy, they had watched long American columns move with a steadiness that seemed to ignore mud, weather, fatigue. They had counted trucks until their eyes blurred, until counting itself felt like surrender. Here, with the hood open and the manual pages catching the last light, they understood why the movement looked the way it did. The design rested on an idea as old as the workshop. Make things simple, repeatable, and forgiving. Because in war, the front line is the least hospitable place to perform a delicate task. A spark plug placed where a chilled hand can reach it is not an accident. It is a decision made months earlier by someone who would never see this roadside. One of the mechanics slid from beneath the frame and wiped his palms on a rag, the gesture slow, almost respectful. He looked again at the transfer case lever and the clean routing of cables, the tidy way the fuel lines ran. You could almost hear the conversation inside his head. How many thousands of drivers were out there right now, using the same lever, reading the same manual, trusting the same wrench? An army becomes a system when its tools whisper the same instructions in every language. Another man thumped the leaf spring with 2 knuckles and listened to the note, as if the steel could tell him how many more miles it carried in its memory. The Hauptfeldwebel closed the toolbox and set it back on its mounts with care. Dignity is not a uniform, he thought. Sometimes it is the way you put another soldier's gear back in place. The supply officer spoke again, softer now. The brilliance, he said, was not hidden. It was hiding in plain sight. Standard bolts meant fewer tools. Fewer tools meant less training. Less training meant a faster road from recruit to driver. A manual with pictures meant a man could learn by looking when words on a page refused to stick. A wooden bed meant repairs could be made with whatever the countryside offered. If the front axle engaged with 1 lever, then a driver did not have to choose from 3. Small mercies accumulate. They become momentum. He did not say Detroit as an accusation or a curse. He said it the way a map says river. No one tried to romanticize the truck. It would not win a beauty contest against a well-kept Opel. Its lines were blunt. Its panels were not the pride of a sculptor. But when the men imagined a week of rain and the ruts of a supply track chewed to paste, they knew which vehicle they wanted under them. Precision is a virtue. Forgiveness is a strategy. The GMC had been built for a war in which 1 million small tasks mattered more than a few elegant ones. That understanding passed between the men without anyone needing to put it into a lecture. In the distance, a late swallow circled, and the sky over the hedgerows held that August color that always feels like a memory arriving early. As dusk settled, they eased the hood down and stood a moment longer, listening to the slow tick of cooling metal. Somewhere, far off, the road hummed with traffic they couldn't see. Another column moving, another shift beginning, another depot emptying into the night. The Hauptfeldwebel gave a quiet order, and they began to ready the truck for tow, each man falling into the simple rhythm of practiced hands. The manual slid back into its slot. The wrenches clicked against each other and were still. In the hush that followed, a canvas flap lifted and fell with the smallest breath of wind, like a flag that remembered what it had been made to do. CCKW trucks during the war, there were so many that the roads themselves seemed to learn their shape, while Germany's entire wartime output of the Opel Blitz, the backbone of Wehrmacht logistics, totaled perhaps 100,000 units. most of them 4x2 machines that lacked the GMC's all-wheel drive bite. Over the next week, our unit put the captured GMC into daily service for supply runs, and it changed everything. Because where our Opel trucks clawed and slipped along muddy farm lanes, this American deuce-and-a-half simply leaned into the earth and went, 6 wheels finding purchase where 2 would surrender. Even when we loaded it past the rating, something that happened more often than anyone cared to admit, it kept working. Not elegant, not proud, just stubborn in the way of tools built to be used. The 6-wheel drive turning soft ground into a problem solved rather than a trap endured. And after only a few days, a supply sergeant who drove it sunrise to dusk gave the verdict none of us wanted to hear, but all of us recognized as true. This truck is reliable in a way our vehicles are not. It's not that it's better built, he said carefully. It's that it's built expecting abuse. Built as if the designers had sat with soldiers who would overload it, who would miss maintenance, who would drive through darkness and fatigue as if trying to break it and still needed it to bring them home. That was the revelation, simple and hard like a stone in the hand, because American engineers had shaped the GMC for the reality of war rather than the theory of it, assuming drivers would be barely trained, that maintenance would be late and hurried, that conditions would be unforgiving. And so they made the truck simple, robust, forgiving, a machine that met you halfway when you were not at your best. On August 25, 1944, the same day the Red Ball Express began its push, the 276th Infantry Division received orders to pull eastward, and on that road we witnessed the lesson that completed our education in American logistics. An American convoy, not a tactical movement but a supply column, rolled along a parallel route, and we started counting. Because that is what soldiers do when facing a number they do not understand. But after half an hour, we let the counting go, because it was like trying to measure the horizon. Truck after truck after truck, the line unbroken, the rhythm almost mechanical, and the silhouettes were nearly all the same. GMC, CCKW after GMC, CCKW. Identical profiles, identical loads, identical speeds. The uniformity itself a kind of strength, and a young soldier beside me, honestly puzzled, asked, "Where are their horses?" Because the boy had never seen a fully motorized army. Not truly, not in the way the Americans had built one. In the Wehrmacht, 4 out of 5 tons that moved did so behind horses, and our division alone required more than 5,000 animals to feed the front. 5,000 mouths that needed fodder and water and rest, and farriers and veterinary care. 5,000 living engines that could manage perhaps 30 kilometers on a good day and would falter by the thousands in winter. American divisions had no horses for logistics. They had trucks, thousands of trucks that could cover hundreds of kilometers in a day, that did not ask for hay, that did not tire or freeze to death, and that difference felt like stepping from one century into another without changing the calendar. That night, the supply officer took out his notebook and made the kind of calculations that turn a feeling into a fact. If each American division carried roughly 2,000 trucks, and there were 40 divisions in France, that meant something like 80,000 trucks in support of combat operations, without even counting the dedicated supply services, while we, across all fronts, could tally perhaps 3 million horses and maybe 100,000 trucks. And someone finally voiced the question that had been sitting in the air between us like an unclaimed pack. How can they produce so many vehicles? The answer hurt to say, because we already knew it in our bones. American automotive plants had embraced mass production long before the war. Ford and the moving line, GM and its systems. And when war arrived, they did not start from zero. They converted. civilian output turning to military output with a motion as practiced as shifting gears. The same factories that built Chevrolet sedans built GMC trucks. The same workers who assembled Oldsmobiles assembled military vehicles. And the transition was seamless because the philosophy was the same: standardization, interchangeability, mass production. While Germany, though rich in talented engineers, lacked this depth of production infrastructure. The Opel plant in Brandenburg, even pushing at its peak, could not match what a single American automotive complex could do, and America had dozens of such complexes, which is a sentence you can say in a breath but can only understand in silence. By September 1944, we had taken 3 more GMC and a Dodge WC63, and the mechanics noticed something that at first seemed like a trick, and then became a truth. Parts slid from one badge to another as if the metal knew a shared language. A GMC carburetor fitting the Dodge, electrical components that agreed with one another, even the tires meeting the same size. Evidence of a decision made far from the front that every truck would be built to a common set of specifications across multiple manufacturers so that any mechanic could service any vehicle and any depot could supply any unit, which meant their logistics were unified in a way ours had never been. The Wehrmacht fielded vehicles from dozens of makers with parts that argued rather than matched. An Opel man could not necessarily nurse a Busing or a Mercedes back to health, and warehouses had to stock for hundreds of types, each one a small puzzle waiting for its missing piece. A logistical nightmare that grew teeth whenever the weather turned. On October 3, 1944, our remaining trucks finally stood still because fuel did not arrive, while the horses, being horses, could forage and survive another day. And we watched the American operations continue, not dramatically, not loudly, simply steadily, because their supply network, anchored by thousands of GMC trucks, delivered fuel with the regularity of breath, forward and forward again. During those halted days, our mechanics studied the captured American trucks, the way a man reads the handwriting of someone who understands something he does not. And one of them said what we were all beginning to accept. We designed our vehicles to be good. They designed theirs to be good enough. And in total war, good enough in overwhelming numbers is the thing that wins. The Hauptfeldwebel wrote a detailed technical report on the GMC CCKW, line after line documenting standardized components, simple maintenance procedures, and a robust construction that chose durability over elegance. And as he closed his notebook, you could hear the soft hush of the canvas top brushing the side of the bed, a small sound in the evening air like a page turned by a careful hand. The report put it plainly, almost reluctantly. The Opel Blitz, it said, beat the GMC in fuel efficiency and in the quick, neat way it could move through tight streets and narrow farm tracks. But those advantages withered when Germany was building 1 truck for every 5 or 6 the Americans rolled out. The conclusion followed with the quiet weight of something already known in the gut. American vehicle production represents industrial capacity we cannot match. Their manufacturing philosophy prioritizes quantity and standardization over individual vehicle perfection. In sustained warfare, this approach has proven devastatingly effective. Variations of that verdict were arriving at Wehrmacht headquarters from every front, a chorus of technical voices saying the same sober thing. The numbers had escaped the reach of tactics. Intelligence analysts gathered the American production figures with a care that felt like handling hot metal. The totals were not just large, they were staggering. 2.4 million military trucks from American factories across the war years. And even together, Germany, Italy, and Japan could not climb close to that summit. Then came December 1944, and the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West. and the lesson turned from paper to road. The logistics plan leaned heavily on capturing American fuel because the Reich did not have enough to feed its own momentum. Orders went out instructing units to use captured American vehicles whenever possible, because the existing German supply chain could not keep pace with the speed and distances the operation demanded. It was a bitter irony. Germany's final throw depending on seizing the very fuel and trucks that explained why Germany was losing. And the 276th Infantry Division took its place in that attempt with a mixed column. A handful of surviving Opel vehicles threaded together with a growing flock of captured GMCs. When the offensive slowed and then stalled, it was not only because American resistance was hard and disciplined, though it was because the German logistics web frayed and snapped under strain. Panzer divisions left tanks where fuel trucks could not reach them. Infantry units put harnesses on horse teams and went back to wagons because motor transport had broken down. Meanwhile, the American supply machine continued with the same mechanical steadiness that had become its signature. The Red Ball Express had ended in November, but the arteries it opened remained, now pumping from Antwerp, Brussels, and Cherbourg. Trucks moved on routes that grew more efficient as engineers repaired bridges and smoothed railheads and widened roads. You could watch it happen and feel the scale. An army as a machine, fed by an industry that never slept, working at a volume Germany had never achieved. In January 1945, with the Ardennes attack spent and German forces pulling back, the captured GMCs in our charge proved invaluable. They still ran. The Opels, asked to endure the same weather, the same loads, the same neglect, had mostly given up the ghost. The difference was not just how the vehicles had been treated. It lived in the way they had been imagined. The GMC had been built to absorb punishment and keep shape. The Opel had been built to a standard of precision that did not forgive wartime abuse. By March, the 276th was holding ground in the Rhineland, and American forces were crossing the Rhine in overwhelming strength, bridges thrown down like decisions, columns pouring over them. Our mechanics watched the American supply rhythm with professional respect that carried a taste of despair. "They've built an army that runs on logistics," the Hauptfeldwebel said, voice low. "And they've built logistics that can't be stopped." He added what none of us liked to say out loud. Our army had been conceived to fight short, decisive campaigns, blitzkrieg that would end before material math took over the conversation. We had never planned for this. Years of sustained fighting against an enemy that could replace what we destroyed faster than we could destroy it. On April 18, 1945, the division surrendered. We were moved as prisoners to processing centers in American GMC trucks, and that ride gave us a final lesson in industrial power without rhetoric. At the camp near Koblenz, we saw motor pools lined with hundreds of trucks, row on row of the same silhouette, maintained by young American soldiers who worked with an ease that would have been impossible in the Wehrmacht. Parts were abundant. Tools were clean and to hand. Manuals were written simply enough that a private with a few days' instruction could attempt a job that would have required a specialist back home. One of our mechanics, still wearing the habits of his trade like a second uniform, spoke with an American motor sergeant who was more friendly than the moment seemed to require. "Your mechanics?" the sergeant asked. "Hell, we need mechanics. Can you work on these?" He nodded toward the GMCs. "Yes," came the answer. "We've maintained several captured ones." "Good. The war's over for you, but these trucks still need care. I can get you assigned to the motor pool. Better than sitting behind wire." Over the next weeks, German mechanics stood shoulder to shoulder with American GIs, maintaining the same vehicles that had pulled the American army across a continent. The sergeant explained their philosophy without pretense. Everything was designed for speed. Quick maintenance, common parts, simple procedures. He tapped the valve cover with a wrench the way a man taps a bar to call for quiet. See this engine? 2 men can do a complete overhaul in about 8 hours with field tools. Our mechanic did not argue. He didn't need to. An Opel overhaul, he said, means factory conditions and specialized equipment. He let the truth sit there. We designed for precision. You designed for practicality. The sergeant nodded. In peacetime, your way probably makes a better vehicle. In war, our way makes vehicles that keep armies moving. Then he asked the question he always asked, a mixture of pride and curiosity. How many you think we built? Our man shrugged. Hundreds of thousands. The sergeant smiled with tired eyes. Over 500,000 of just this model. Then there's the Dodges, the Studebakers, the Internationals. Millions of trucks total. That's what won the war. He didn't say it as a boast. Not really. More like a mechanic stating a torque value. Tight enough to hold. Not so tight it breaks. And we believed him. Not because of the number alone, but because we had lived inside the consequences. Columns that did not end. Depots that did not empty. Vehicles that invited ordinary hands to keep them alive. Standing at the edge of the motor pool, you could smell warm oil and canvas and a hint of fresh paint where some panel had been replaced that morning. Beyond the fence, a line of poplars trembled in a thin breeze, their leaves flicking like signals. And somewhere in that forest of parked trucks, a cooling engine ticked steadily, a small metronome counting out the truth we had learned at last. Not better equipment, but more equipment than you could ever destroy. The American continued in that unhurried, matter-of-fact tone mechanics use when explaining why a stubborn bolt finally turns. You know what's funny? He said. These trucks aren't complicated. We took commercial truck technology, barely modified it for military work. The engines are commercial designs, the transmissions commercial. And then we just made it rugged and produced it in massive quantities. That was the line that settled in the German minds like a weight, because the lesson wasn't about a single clever part. It was about the philosophy that chose plain steel over ornament and speed over ceremony. That was the lesson the German mechanics absorbed completely, not just the sound of it, but the shape. America had won through industrial philosophy as much as industrial capacity. Design for mass production from the start. Standardize ruthlessly. Prize reliability over sophistication, and build supply chains that can feed a moving army without end. In the months that followed, many of those mechanics lived the proof as prisoners. Some assigned to American motor pools, where the scale of logistics revealed itself every morning without announcement. Convoys in their hundreds crossing occupied Germany. Repair depots stacked with more spare parts than entire Wehrmacht divisions had ever possessed. Production systems so efficient that a battered vehicle might be replaced outright because a new truck would arrive before a full repair could even be scheduled. And as 1945 slipped toward its close and repatriation began, those same men returned to a homeland in ruins, cities like rubble fields, factories silent. But everywhere the emblem of what had beaten them: American vehicles at work in the daylight, GMC trucks hauling concrete and timber for bridges, Jeeps moving occupation details and officials, ordinary equipment pushing the first stones of reconstruction into place. The former Hauptfeldwebel, now simply a civilian with oil under his nails and a knack for getting things running, found work at a reconstruction depot in Frankfurt, and because he understood American vehicles, he became useful quickly. One afternoon, while teaching a circle of young Germans how to read a maintenance manual the way a farmer reads weather, he let himself say what the war had taught him, the words heavy but not angry, Before the war, we believed German engineering would carry the day, that quality would beat quantity. We were wrong. The Americans understood modern industrial warfare better. They built adequate equipment in overwhelming numbers, standardized without apology, designed for the army they had. The army of millions of ordinary men, rather than the elite specialists we liked to imagine. And he gestured through the window toward the depot yard where a row of weathered GMCs waited for new assignments. "These trucks aren't masterpieces," he said softly, "but there are hundreds of thousands of them. They use the same parts. Any soldier can drive them. Any mechanic can fix them. The genius isn't in the individual vehicle. It's in the system that makes them, feeds them, and keeps them in the fight." By 1947, the Marshall Plan was moving across Germany like a patient tide, and much of that aid traveled on American trucks. German mechanics kept them alive, and in doing so, practiced the lessons they'd been forced to learn. Standardization, component commonality, design for manufacturability. Ideas that sounded dry on paper, but felt like mercy when you were standing in a cold depot trying to get a stalled line of transport back on the road. As German industry slowly reassembled itself, many shops and factories began to fold those same principles into their own work, not abandoning precision, but guiding it toward production that could scale, production that forgave the small sorrows of real life. The GMC CCKW remained in American service into the 1960s, stubborn proof of a design that had chosen durability over spectacle, and many served even longer in Allied inventories. The Opel Blitz, an excellent vehicle by any peacetime measure, had become, fairly or not, a symbol of what Germany had lacked in the war years. Sufficient numbers, four-wheel drive in most models, a parts language that spoke across makers and miles. In the decades that followed, German automotive companies found a way to walk both roads at once. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, the rebuilt Volkswagen, all learning to merge the pride of German precision with mass production discipline, the crisp line of a blueprint with the hum of a moving line, building vehicles where tolerances and throughput could shake hands without either one losing face. And the very men who had once crawled beneath captured GMs with a mixture of resentment and respect. Former Wehrmacht mechanics who had maintained both German and American machines became valued consultants to the rebuilding effort because they could explain, from the grease up, why the American system had proven superior in sustained conflict and how a factory might be taught to think like an army on the march. One such consultant, in a 1967 interview for an automotive trade journal, described the lesson with a craftsman's economy of words. No bitterness, just the measurement of a truth. The GMC taught us that in modern warfare, perfection becomes the enemy of good enough. We built beautiful vehicles so complex they were hard to produce in the quantities we needed, and too delicate for maintenance in the field. America built adequate vehicles by the million and made them repairable by anyone. We did not lose because our engineers were inferior, but because we misunderstood what industrial warfare demanded. The article ran beside a photograph of a restored GMC CCKW in a museum, its paint new, its angles still honest. The caption read, "American GMC CCKW deuce and a half. Over 560,000 produced, 1941 to 1945. Backbone of the Red Ball Express, an emblem of how mass production and standardization overwhelmed the Axis." Next to it stood a restored Opel Blitz, the placard equally proud but quieter. German Opel Blitz 3-ton truck. Approximately 100,000 produced, 1937 to 1944. An excellent design constrained by limited production capacity and, in most models, the absence of four-wheel drive. You didn't need to be an engineer to understand the story those two shapes told in silence. Both trucks were well designed. Only one existed in numbers that turned roads into arteries, perhaps into a kind of destiny. That one accepted standardized parts, simple maintenance, and lived inside a logistics network that could carry armies across seasons. The other remained a quality product created in insufficient quantities by an industrial base that could not keep pace with the sheer volume of American manufacturing. And when the mechanics who had first opened the hood of a captured GMC in August 1944 looked back, they knew they had read the future without a map. Because what they held in their hands that day was not just a truck. It was the sound of an entire system breathing, like a long, even idle that never quite runs down. The last sound those men remembered wasn't the roar of an engine or the cry of a commander. It was the steady ticking of cooling metal, the same soft rhythm that closed their days in the field, long after the fighting had burned itself out. That sound had followed them through years of war, into captivity, and finally back to a homeland trying to stand again. And maybe that's where the story truly ends, not in the noise of victory or defeat, but in that quiet pulse of machines built to endure, and of men learning what endurance really means. The GMC truck they once studied under foreign skies had become more than a vehicle in memory. It was a teacher, a mirror, a riddle with an answer written in steel. It spoke of a truth they hadn't seen when they still believed war could be won by brilliance alone. It told them that strength isn't always elegance, that sometimes resilience hides inside simplicity, and that unity, across tools, across people, across purpose, can build something no single act of genius ever could. Every nut that fit every bolt, every manual that showed a soldier how to keep the machine breathing, was a small vote for trust. Trust in ordinary hands, trust in cooperation. The former mechanics used to say that when they worked on those American trucks in the post-war years, they felt a kind of calm. It wasn't admiration for the enemy, it was respect for the idea that had beaten them. A sense that the real frontier of war had never been the battlefield, but the human capacity to organize, to adapt, to think in systems rather than in sparks. They carried that understanding home, into the factories and schools and families of a wounded nation. And quietly, without speeches, they began rebuilding the world with that same discipline, the kind that prefers connection over pride. When you look back at stories like this, it's easy to think they belong to another time, another kind of men. But perhaps that's too simple, because every generation faces its own version of that roadside discovery, the moment when what you thought was strength turns out to be something else entirely. Maybe it happens in a workshop, a family, a country. Maybe it comes when you realize that the things you build together, slowly, are what will last when everything loud has passed. There's something deeply human about that GMC in the rain, about the German mechanic tracing his fingers over a line of bolts all made the same size. He wasn't seeing defeat anymore. He was seeing a design philosophy that treated every soldier as worthy of simplicity, every hand as capable of repair. And perhaps that's the quiet moral buried under the mud and memory of war. The world moves forward when we make things easier for others to carry. If you think about it, every great change in history comes down to that same heartbeat: shared knowledge, shared effort, shared purpose. Wars end, flags change, but the act of building something that endures remains sacred. It's there in the hands of the man who rebuilds an old truck, in the patience of someone teaching a craft to another, in the kindness of a stranger offering a tool instead of a word. The lesson of the GMC and the Opel isn't really about who built more trucks. It's about who built systems of trust, who understood that the simplest form of strength is cooperation. And maybe that's what history is for. Not to glorify what was broken, but to understand how people tried to mend it. These stories, told and retold, are not just about weapons and logistics. They're about the quiet genius of persistence, the stubborn hope that says, even in ruin, we can still learn. Even in defeat, we can still build something worth passing on. When I think about those men, long gone now, I imagine them not as soldiers or prisoners, but as craftsmen. One turning a wrench beside an American he might once have fought, another sketching a diagram on the back of a crate, both trying to make something work again. Their silence wasn't shame. It was a kind of peace. And in that silence, the world began to heal. If you've ever stood over a machine that wouldn't start, or looked at something broken and thought, I can fix this, then you already understand them. It's the same instinct that builds bridges after wars, the same faith that keeps communities alive, the same heartbeat that hums under every story told here. Perhaps you, listening now, have your own version of that roadside moment. Some lesson life taught you when you weren't expecting it. Maybe it wasn't about engines or steel. Maybe it was about people, or patience, or learning that strength sometimes means letting go. I'd like to hear that. If you're somewhere out there, in a small town or a big city, across the ocean or just down the road, tell me, what did history teach you about endurance, about what's really worth building? That's what WWII History Tales is meant for, not just remembering the machines or the maps, but the humanity that ran beneath them. Every story here is a bridge between the past and the people listening now. If you stay with us, you'll find more of these quiet truths, moments where engineering meets empathy, where a piece of metal becomes a mirror for the human heart. Thank you for listening, for remembering, for caring enough to carry these stories forward. Whether you're in Chicago or Berlin, Saigon or Madrid, whether you watch on a screen small enough to fit in your palm or hear these words drifting into sleep, know this: you are part of the long chain that keeps history alive. The road is quieter now. The last of the old engines have gone still. But somewhere, in a museum or a forgotten yard, a GMC deuce and a half rests under soft light, its paint dulled, its bolts still aligned, waiting for a hand to brush the dust away. When that happens, the metal will breathe again for a moment, and in that breath, the story continues.